Welcome to the lecture on the New South, Economic Progress and Social Condition. This is your Goldfield History book, Chapter 17. The section that we're going to be looking at today is the New South, specifically the newness of the New South. Now, I need you to understand that this concept of newness is juxtaposed with its status quo. And you're going to see here a lot of different things. Yes, this is a tremendous time of economic growth in the South. However, it still lags behind that of the North, and it was not huge gains in economic improvement. However, it did have a dramatic impact on the people of the South. With this New South, cities brought newspapers, consumer products, and new values to the countryside. We're going to talk about those new values in a different chapter. However, they didn't bring electricity, telephones, or public health, or school services. So if you lived in the towns and cities, then things improved for you. But if you still lived in the countryside, things were still pretty much the same as it had always been. Another example of this juxtaposition is this is the first generation of African Americans that were born after emancipation. They expected self-respect, the right to work, the right to vote, the right to go to school, and to travel freely. However, this is still the same time period following Reconstruction when Southern Democrats reassert control over Southern politics in eliminating voting rights of almost all African Americans, including poor whites, while suppressing challenges to their leadership. And again, we'll come back to this when we talk about race relations in the South. An industrial and urban South is where we start to get into the specifics of the economy for the South. Specifically here in Birmingham, it was the iron and the steel industry, and that is going to be largely because of the large deposits of coal, limestone, and iron ore, which are all used to make what's called pig iron. And Birmingham rose to prominence very quickly. I believe Birmingham was established in 1870, 1871, but these large reserves, coupled with a cheap labor force or an abundant labor force, made it an excellent choice for steel production. Coal production was another area in which Alabama had plentiful resources. It increased by 44 million tons produced per year from the years of 1875 to 1900. So that is quite a substantial increase. The Southern textile industry is going to be relocated to the South. Primarily, you'll remember in 10th grade we talked about how textiles really began in the New England area, but over time, with the recreation or the shifting of all of these different economies, the Southern textile industry is going to be relocated to the Carolina Piedmont region. And I have a map here to show you that. But these mills were generally located in rural areas close to good railroads, cheap and abundant labor, and cheap energy. Notice that they weren't centered around towns. And notice here I have a couple of graphics for you. You have the Piedmont region, which extends really from the northeastern United States all the way into Alabama. And of course it follows the foothills of those Appalachian Mountains. And then very specifically I have the Carolina Piedmont on the left. The tobacco industry was an interesting phenomenon here in the South. You know that tobacco was the crop that helped to make the Jamestown colony successful, and that never really went away. It was just supplanted by cotton. And New South advocates really wanted to do away with that heavy reliance on cotton. So there was a resurgence in the belief of promoting secondary crops like tobacco. And you had tobacco in Virginia and rice and sugarcane in Louisiana. And really this revival or this resurgence of tobacco is really going to be due to the development of new varieties such as the bright leaf or the burley. And this was brought home by Union soldiers who had smoked it when they were, of course, fighting the war here in the South. Continuing about the Southern tobacco industry, James B. Duke is going to be one of the successes of the South. He installed the first cigarette-making machine in Durham, North Carolina, making it a commercial process. And to give you an idea of his success, by 1900, his company controlled 80% of tobacco manufacturing in the United States. And also, James Duke is going to be one of the few Southern businessman who does not need to rely on banks in order to keep his investments going. And we're going to be discussing about those banks in just a moment. The Coca-Cola industry. All of us have had a Coke from time to time. We talked briefly about this in class earlier, but it was developed by a pharmacist, an Atlanta pharmacist, Mr. Pemberton, and he needed money, so he sold it to Asa Candler, who bought the rights, changed the formula up a little bit, and marketed it. Now, I have heard lots of different stories about whether or not Coca-Cola actually had cocaine in it. I know that it was developed from coca leaves, which I believe is where cocaine comes from. But whatever the truth is, by the 1890s, it served a national market, so it was very popular. The lumber industry in the South. Now, your textbook does not necessarily talk that much about it other than its small investing. It was not something that required a very large investment. And this is because of the plentiful southern pine trees that are here in the South. Like here in Alabama, we have the loblolly pine that's very prevalent throughout the state. But they were cheap and an abundant source for rebuilding following the war. Their soft wood made it really excellent for many of the uses in this industrial age. And really, the United States, or the South, was very lucky in that at the same time all of this lumber is being cut down and whole forests are being clear cut, we had the development of scientific forestry. And so you have the first forestry school that's going to be located in, I believe it's in South Carolina. But this lumber also provided for paper commerce as well, because they used the waste from producing lumber and turning it into pulp, which makes paper. So that was another area. But again, the lumber industry, it was something that was mobile. It could go from one stand of trees to another stand of trees. And again, we'll get to that in just a moment. Now, other industries that arose here in the South, you have the clay, glass, and stone industries. Alabama clay, the red clay, is very popular with many artists. And of course, we have the limestone, which is oftentimes used with the glass and stone. Hydroelectricity, our abundant rivers and our varying elevations made the South, as well as Alabama, a natural place for cheap energy. The canneries, many of those sprang up across the South, thanks in part to that refrigerated rail car that will be invented by Gustavus Swift, because vegetables that were grown that were not shipped elsewhere in the United States would be sold to canneries, who would can them for sale, of course. And then the beverage industry, and that's just kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference to the alcohol industry here in the South. I have pictures of moonshine here. Your book references mint juleps and a couple of others here in the South. Now, Southern Railroad construction. Again, this represents that juxtaposition in the South. Southern Railroad track mileage doubled from 1880 to 1890. That's really a statement more about the lack of track in the South as opposed to this phenomenal growth. Not to say that there wasn't phenomenal growth, but these Southern railroads fueled the growth of industry here in the South. For example, in 1886, Southern railroads finally conformed to a national standard track gauge. Prior to the Civil War, Southern tracks were a different size than trains in the North, and so to make that bridge between North and South, quite literally, trains either had to change their wheels or something needed to be modified so that they could continue on in the South. And the importance of this is it connected the South to a national transportation network. Now, railroads helped to end rural isolation because it did bring goods to the South. It made these goods more readily available. It allowed for easier and faster transportation. It also contributed to Florida's burgeoning tourism industry. And I have here a picture of the Jacksonville Pier. They say this picture was taken somewhere around in the very early 1900s. And interior cities replaced coastal cities as hubs. And I created a graphic for you. And here you have a picture of New Orleans at the turn of the century, 1900. And then you have a picture of Atlanta, and notice the focus here. On the left, you have New Orleans with its ports because, of course, waterways were the important routes for shipping and transportation. But as railroads become more plentiful, you see the shift to the railroads that is the focus of the Atlanta picture. So notice how ports are replaced by railroads as this industry takes off. Towns on rail lines became marketing hubs for the countryside. And I have here a couple of small towns, and if you've ever traveled some of the smaller highways, particularly if you travel up 78 Highway going towards Gewen and parts of North Alabama, you'll come across all of these different small towns, and you'll be going down the highway and all of a sudden this small town appears. And my theory is that these were towns that were probably located either on a railroad or on a major highway at one time, and so these areas became centers for people in the countryside. But as we moved away from that agrarian way of life, those fell into disuse over time and people just moved away. Now, industrial growth, as I mentioned before, did not keep pace with the North. It was phenomenal growth here in the South. Make no mistake about that. However, I listed here some statistics here for you to kind of break it down for you. Now, notice that although we have this phenomenal growth, the Southern share of capital was down to 11.5% of the overall nation's share of capital. By the late 19th century, Southern industrial workers earned half the national average. Some percentage of people worked in the same percentage of people worked in manufacturing in 1900 as in 1850. So what that says is that you have the same number of people making things before the war as you did after the war. The South's share of manufacturing went from 10.3% to 10.5%. It's a gain, but not an appreciable gain. And from 1860 to 1880, per capita income declined from 72% of national average to 51%. And then the statistic continues in your textbook where it talks about it had only regained up until 62% by 1920. So it's growing. So really, I would say, in my own personal opinion, that this whole concept of a New South never really came to fruition, although it was definitely a real goal established by many leaders in the South. Now, the limits of this industrial and urban growth. If things were so cheap in the South, why was there not more investment? Which is a very fair question. And we have three different reasons here. You have low wages, which meant less spending. If you don't make a lot of money, you're not going to go out and buy a whole lot of things. So because you don't buy a lot of things, you don't spend a lot of money on sales taxes. If you do not buy property, you do not pay property taxes. So this meant less tax revenue, and less tax revenue meant less money spent on things like public health and public education and roads. Low wages also kept immigrants and their energy out of the South. While the North is experiencing this tremendous industrial growth at this same time period in American history, they are facing wave after wave of immigrant coming into the United States, all looking for work. And this provided an abundant labor source which kept costs low, which encouraged companies to invest in mass production. You don't see that here in the South. As a matter of fact, immigrant population declined from 10% to 2% here in the South because they just weren't interested in coming here to the South because our wages were even lower than the low wages that they were receiving in the North. And we had no services. The third reason was a lack of capital prevented the South from developing a thriving banking industry. And that is largely because of really the Civil War. The Republican-controlled Congress had set many restrictions on the creation of banks, and this had a deep impact here in the South. And one of the things that were required was that banks had to have $50,000 in capital in order to establish a bank. Very few Southerners had that kind of money, because remember, the South is rebuilding after the war, and the only people that really had that kind of money, of course, are going to be the banks in the North. Because Southern banks and Southern investments were riskier, Northern banks imposed higher interest and shorter term loans because we were a greater risk at the time. And as an example of that, northern banks took over failed southern rail lines and controlled 5 of the major rail lines here in the South before it was all up, by around 1900 or the turn of the century. So, Southern textiles, while they were a great success story, they depended on thousands of small investors. What this means is that there is no encouragement for innovation and is going to remain small scale. Remember, I told you that textile factories tended to stay in rural areas close to the railroads because people would, of course, bring the cotton to them from the countryside. And I mentioned the lumber industry earlier. Lumber industry required very little capital. It relied on cheap, unskilled, and abundant labor. It processed raw materials there on the site, and when they were finished, after they had cleared all the trees, they moved on to the next location. So it was not one that required a huge amount of capital. Birmingham's Iron and Steel was bought out by U.S. Steel because over time it became cheaper and cheaper, and you see that U.S. Steel, as they began to make steel production more efficient, it is going to be owned by Andrew Carnegie. And because Birmingham had cheaper labor and cheaper cost, it could be sold more cheaply. But because U.S. Steel favored the Pittsburgh plant, the pricing of Birmingham steel was such so that Pittsburgh steel was bought. And I'll try to explain that better in class if you would like. So, farms to cities, the impact on Southerners. Let's talk about the textile industry again. The textile industry, you had huge numbers of people abandoning failed farms and coming to these textile factories to work. Entire families moved to these textile villages where they provided these families with homes. They provided them with a company town, with a company store. So much so that 1/3 of textile workers were children under 14, and predominantly textile workers were women and children. Despite the limited growth of cities in the South, it did dramatically alter Southern society. These towns offered amenities not available in the countryside. You could get roads, you could get electricity, you could get running water. Not to mention, you could go see a show, you could buy some of the more fashionable goods. So there were amenities offered that had not ever really been offered before. The cities attracted talented and ambitious young people from the region. People would come together to make things happen, and so this kind of contributed to that idea of the New South. And the towns offered jobs to a wide range of people. And so you had this diverse group together in towns. However, there was a dark side to that. Some saw cities and towns as bastions of evil, with all the alcohol, with the dance halls. Some people saw technology and urbanization itself just as an evil. This focus on urbanization and wealth and technology and display was considered to be a second Yankee conquest, and many people resented it, and that was what they saw these new cities, or this growth of cities, as is the second Yankee conquest. And finally, urbanization and commercialization challenged Southern ideas of agrarianism. And I put here that phrase, venerate the plow, because this is a challenge to that Jeffersonian idea that you have this educated farmer elite that would contribute to society and take care of others in society because it was the right thing to do. And as long as you tilled the earth and you grew things out of the earth, then you were always going to be self-reliant. And we see this shift. As farms become more commercialized, white farmers begin to feel threatened, and their independence feels threatened, and so they resent this urbanization. So this brings us to the end of the newness of the New South. The next section we're going to be covering is race relations in the South, and you should be seeing that soon. So look forward to seeing you in class, and have a good night. Bye-bye.